Hello and welcome to Psycho Killer, the podcast about Britain's worst criminals and their crimes. I'm Simon Ford, a writer and journalist.
I'm Jacques Morrell, a former major crime detective with experience investigating homicides and sexually based offences.
And I'm Pip Watts, a TV and radio reporter on a mission to get inside the minds of monsters and try to understand why they do what they do. In this podcast, we're looking into a series of murders that left a community in shock. Over 10 days in the run-up to Christmas 2006, the coastal town of Ipswich was stunned by the discovery of 5 bodies.
At one stage, a body was turning up every couple of days. On 5 occasions, officers would attend a location and update the control room. Quebec Zulu 4, I'm 10-6 and can confirm we have 1/1. 10-6 is on scene and 1/1, life extinct.
There was a serial killer on the loose, and as you're about to hear, the case shone a light on a world of pain, desperation and fear that polite society preferred to pretend didn't exist.
It's time to head to the dark side and the hunt for the Suffolk Strangler.
Insidious. The word means proceeding in a gradual, subtle way, but with a very harmful effect. Insidious perfectly describes the effects of heroin on a human being. One try, we're told, is enough to get us hooked. The thing is, smack isn't like that. It takes its time, and slowly, insidiously, it undermines the identities of those who take it.
People take heroin to feel happy, relaxed, euphoric and sleepy. That first hit makes most of them throw up. The lucky ones stop there. Gemma Adams was one of those who didn't stop.
Gemma Rose Adams was a bright, popular child from a middle-class home. She was born in Kesgrave, a sleepy little town on the outskirts of Ipswich, a seaport in the county of Suffolk. Gemma left school and got a job with an insurance firm, but she was fired because she was addicted to heroin. You'll find lots of pictures of Gemma online. She was a beautiful young woman with sparkling blue eyes and long blonde hair. She has a wonderfully engaging smile and looks confidently into the camera. Then there's the police mugshot. Her smile is gone. Her eyes are hollow. Her skin is pockmarked. This Gemma looks like a zombie. That's what heroin does to you.
Over time, heroin causes cravings and a strong drive to keep on using. As heroin is used regularly, the body builds up a tolerance, so you have to start taking more and more and more. In 2006, Gemma was living in Ipswich with her smackhead boyfriend. She was working as a prostitute to finance her addiction. Gemma's family had no idea. Her boyfriend knew, and he didn't care. Gemma was last seen on West End Road in Ipswich in the small hours of the 15th of November 2006. Her naked body was found in a river at Hintlesham more than a fortnight later. She'd been strangled. She was 25 years old.
Gemma's was the first body to be found, but she wasn't the first victim of a serial killer who quickly became known as the Suffolk Strangler. Tanya Nickel, a 19-year-old from Ipswich, vanished on the 30th of October 2006. Police divers recovered her body from a river 6 weeks later. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and a post-mortem examination couldn't establish a definite cause of death. Tanya attended Chantry High School, now called Chantry Academy, but left home at 16 to live in a hostel. She worked as a prostitute to fund her addiction to heroin and cocaine. She'd originally worked in massage parlours, but was asked to leave on suspicion she was using drugs. Her mother didn't know her daughter was a sex worker. She thought Tanya had a job in a bar or a hairdresser's. The bodies of Tanya and Gemma were found 6 days apart on the 2nd and 8th of December. Then on the 10th, a third victim was found by the A14 road near Kempton. She was later identified as Anneli Alderton. According to a police statement, she had been asphyxiated and was about 3 months pregnant when she died. Anneli was found naked, posed in the cruciform position.
Anneli was 24. She'd moved around a bit after her parents separated and attended Copplestone High School in Ipswich. She left with good grades, despite being hooked on drugs from the age of about 16. When she died, Anneli was going to visit Ipswich. She caught the train from Colchester in Essex and was last seen alive on the 3rd of December. A CCTV picture shows her wearing a black coat and hoop earrings, standing between the green upholstered seats of a connecting service from Harwich to Manningtree. Time to bring in Jack, our experienced homicide investigator. 3 bodies have been found on the outskirts of Ipswich in just over a week. What would the police be doing at this point?
Well, looking at the initial sequence of events, the first murder investigation started on the 2nd of December with the discovery of Gemma's body. She'd been missing for almost 3 weeks. Now, the on-call detective inspector would have been involved, joined by local detectives who were on duty at the time. And by the time the murder squad were briefed up, it would be known that there was another woman, also a sex worker, Tanya Nicol, who'd been missing for about 8 weeks. By the time the homicide detectives were in place, and the local media reporting on it, another woman named Anneli Alderton went missing. At this stage, though, there's only one murder being investigated. So you're looking at a DCI, maybe 2 DIs, a couple of DSs with their teams, the DCI to oversee the crime scene with the crime scene manager, maybe 1 DI to oversee the post-mortem, and the other one to oversee the outside inquiries, the obvious inquiries. Local specialists, well, you'd have some interaction with the sex worker community and any of the charities that are supporting them. You'd have a crime scene manager, an incident room manager, and probably someone to manage the intelligence. So let's think about those other missing person reports. They'd certainly be raised to high risk, if they'd not been already, and more staff asked to look into them. But these may have stayed with the local area commander, at this stage at least. That initial team of detectives had a few days to make some good progress into Gemma Adams' death. That said, because she'd been left in the water for some time, the forensic evidence on her turned out to be the weakest in all 5 cases. That all changed by the time that Tanya Nicholls' body was found 5 days later on the 8th of December, when that call for extra staff would have been raised. So I guess by the 9th of December, a week after the first body, the investigation team had expanded, probably 4-fold. There'd be a dedicated press officer, additional staff to work on the CCTV, research, intelligence. A big team is being formed. Now, whether the killer's name was already on a document in that incident room, I don't know. But what we do know is he wasn't put off, because the day that Tanya Nicholls' body was found was also the day that Annette Nicholls went missing.
With all that going on behind the scenes, Suffolk Constabulary went public. They held a news conference where investigators warned all women to stay away from the red light district of Ipswich. 2 days later, they called another news conference to announce the discovery of 2 more bodies on the 12th of December. This time, the bodies had been dumped in the eastern outskirts of Ipswich. The first 2 had been dumped to the west of the town. Maybe too much police activity had made the killer adjust his tactics.
On the 14th of December, the police confirmed that one of the bodies was 24-year-old Paula Clennell. Paula had gone missing on the 10th of December, the day that the detectives realised they had a serial killer. According to Suffolk Police, she died from compression of the throat. On the following day, the 15th of December, the police confirmed that the other body was that of 29-year-old Annette Nicholls. The bodies of Paula and Annette were both found in Kempton, an area near to where Anneli Alderton's body was discovered. A member of the public reported Paula's body lying 20 feet from the main road, and a police helicopter hovering over the scene also spotted Annette's body nearby. Suffolk Constabulary linked the killings and launched a multiple murder investigation, codenamed Operation Sumac. The good news, albeit the detectives didn't know it yet, was that the killer was leaving good forensic evidence. He had to be local, and he had to be caught. So, Pip, what do we know about Annette Nicholls and Paula Clennell?
Well, both Annette and Paula were drug addicts and sex workers. They were on the streets of Ipswich to fund their addictions. I'm not passing judgment, those are just the facts. And I'm bound to say that in England, if you need treatment for drug addiction, you're entitled to NHS care in the same way as anyone else who has a health problem. And with the right help and support, it's possible for you to get drug-free and stay that way. Tragically, Annette, Paula and the others were murdered before they could turn their lives around. Annette was 29 and she had a little boy. She was a qualified beautician before the drugs dragged her down. Moving from one social housing flat to another, she asked her mother to look after her son. That way, he didn't have to see or hear what went on, and Annette could spend more time doing business. Annette's body was naked and posted cruciform like Anneli Alderton. Again, there was no sign of sexual assault. It looked like she'd been strangled, but the pathologist couldn't say for sure. Paula Clennell had moved to Suffolk from Northumberland. Once again, her body was found naked, but not sexually assaulted. This time, the pathologist could give a definite cause of death: compression of the throat. Aged 24, Paula was a mum of 3. She'd spent part of her childhood in care, which is where she'd got into drugs. A TV news crew sent to report on the first 2 murders interviewed Paula on the street. She told Anglia Tonight's reporter Simon Newton that the killings made her a bit wary about getting into cars, but she continued to work because I need the money.
Back at the Operation Sumac incident room, Suffolk Police realised they had an unusual case. They knew that serial killers often go for notoriety, that they often escalate, killing again and again, until they're either caught or, in some cases, they take their own lives.
And in other cases, like Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, they cease killing and just drop off the radar altogether.
Yes, absolutely, Simon. And the investigators knew they had a narrow window in which to catch the killer before he struck again or disappeared, possibly to resurface somewhere else at a later date. Already some media outlets were calling this killer the Ipswich Ripper, and the comparison with Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who'd claimed 13 victims during his reign of terror, wasn't lost on Suffolk Constabulary. Chief Constable Alistair McWhirter acknowledged that his police force would need outside help. A senior investigator with the Metropolitan Police, Commander Dave Johnston, was reportedly drafted in from Scotland Yard as an advisor. During a series of news conferences, the senior investigating officer, Detective Chief Superintendent Stuart-Gull, said the locations where the bodies were found were probably deposition sites, meaning the women were murdered elsewhere and their bodies were taken to the places where they were found. The SIO didn't say, though, where the women may have been murdered.
DCS-Gull also revealed that some items of women's clothing and accessories, including a handbag and jacket, had been recovered and were being forensically tested to establish whether they belonged to any of the murdered women. To start with, Stuart-Gull had 300 officers under his command. That number increased to 650 including 300 officers from 40 other police forces who assisted in the inquiry. Detectives who'd been handling between 400 and 500 calls a day were then able to answer thousands. This was the opposite approach to the much criticised Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, where West Yorkshire police blundered on for years, rejecting outside assistance and fresh thinking.
OK, now, whoever the serial killer was, he needed to be stopped, and stopped quickly. There would be no repeat of the fiasco that still haunted police commanders more than 30 years after Sutcliffe was jailed. And so it was that on Monday the 18th of December 2006, Suffolk Constabulary reported that they'd arrested a 37-year-old Suffolk man on suspicion of murdering all 5 women. This man was held for questioning for 96 hours, the maximum allowed under English law. Their hand, though, had been forced. The man was Tom Stevens, who'd called police mumbling incoherently, saying he was worried about whether he had a split personality and if he was doing things he didn't know about, then going back to his normal personality. The added complication was that Stevens used local sex workers on a regular basis. Fortunately, the inquiry team soon had their eyes on another man.
Before dawn the next day, police raided a flat on London Road in Ipswich's red light district and arrested a second suspect. DCS-Stuart-Gull called a news conference later that day.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A second man has now been arrested by detectives investigating the murder of 5 women in Suffolk. The 48-year-old man was arrested at his home address in Ipswich at approximately 5 a.m. this morning, Tuesday the 19th of December 2006. He has been arrested on suspicion of murdering all 5 women: Gemma Adams, Tania Nicol, Anneli Alderton, Paula Clennell and Annette Nicholls.
On Tuesday the 21st of December, the police and the Crown Prosecution Service announced that the second suspect had been charged with all 5 murders. Mike Crimp from the CPS spoke at a news conference with DCS-Gull.
We've been working with officers from the Suffolk Constabulary for the last 8 days, advising on a number of preliminary legal issues both before and after arrest. As this case has developed, we have been carefully examining and assessing the evidence in order to come to a charging decision at the earliest possible opportunity. This evening, we've made the decision that there is sufficient evidence and authorised that Stephen Wright, born on the 24th of April 1958, of London Road, Ipswich, should be charged with the murder of Tanya Nicol, Gemma Adams, Anneli Alderton, Annette Nicholls and Paula Clennell. We will continue to keep this case under constant review as it develops.
Steven-Gerald-James-Wright had a checkered past. He'd been a merchant seaman, a chef on North Sea ferries, and a steward on the prestigious ocean liner the QE2. He married his first wife Angela in 1978. They had a son, Michael, but separated in 1987 and later divorced. Wright didn't let the grass grow. He married his second wife Diane in August the same year, but they divorced less than a year later. He had a variety of jobs, onshore too. He was a lorry driver, a barman, a landlord, and a pub manager. He was a forklift truck driver when the police caught up with him. Wright had 3 vices: alcohol, gambling, and paying for sex. The first 2 cost him his cushy pub manager's job. His gambling debts had overwhelmed him, and he was declared bankrupt in the late 90s. He was convicted of theft in 2001, his only criminal conviction, for stealing 80 quid to pay a man he owed. It was a downward spiral, and then, in 2001, he met Pamela. In 2004, they moved to Ipswich. It looked like Steve Wright had turned over a new leaf, but there was still one addiction he couldn't break.
Wright made no bones about paying for sex. It started when he was in the Merchant Navy and went on throughout his life. He'd kicked the booze and the gambling, but he could not shake off that particular urge. In Ipswich, he used sauna and massage parlours that were actually brothels. Wright was a regular punter down the red light district. He paid at least a dozen women for sex between October and December 2006. During his trial, he told the court that 3 of the women he paid for sex were among the murder victims. The working girls nicknamed him Mondeo Man and Silver-backed Gorilla because of his hair colour and stocky body. Wright's signature Ford Mondeo car would form part of the evidence against him. Investigators found tiny flecks of blood on the back seat that partially matched Paula Clennell's DNA. The police were granted an arrest warrant based on this and other forensic evidence tying Wright to the victims.
Steve Wright appeared before Ipswich magistrates on the 22nd of December 2006 and spent 2 years in prison on remand before his trial started on the 16th of January 2008. The court heard how the bodies of Anneli Alderton and Annette Nicholls were deliberately posed in the cruciform position. DNA and fibre evidence linked Wright to the murdered women. Jurors were taken to sites involved in the case, including London Road and the sites where the women's bodies were found. The defence argued that Wright frequented prostitutes and had full sex with all of the victims except Tanya Nickel, whom he picked up with the intention of having sex, but apparently changed his mind and returned her to Ipswich's red light district. This contradicted Wright's earlier statement when stopped by police in the district in the early hours of the morning. He made out that he didn't know he was in the red light area and was driving around because he couldn't sleep. Wright's rented flat, 79 London Road, was in the red light area. The prosecution suggested Wright may have had an accomplice, since Anneli Alderton was found some distance from the road, but with no evidence that her body had been dragged there by just one person. Even so, most of the evidence was circumstantial. CCTV footage of Wright cruising the red light district, his DNA found on some of the bodies, along with fibres from his car and home, neighbours who'd heard banging noises late at night. In police interviews, Wright was tight-lipped.
This is your earliest opportunity to give an account. And that is significant because it makes a difference. You need to give us an account as to what's happened. We've got the last girl to go missing with your DNA and the one before with your DNA. Both on their naked bodies. How can that be? No comment.
Under cross-examination, Wright stuck to his story. He used prostitutes for sex, but he didn't kill them.
Wright admitted that he had had sex with 4 of his victims, but during cross-examination he claimed it was just a coincidence, giving this same explanation 53 times.
The defence said the evidence could be explained away by the fact that their client had picked up the women in order to have sex. The jury had to decide, was Wright a killer or just a curb crawler? In his summing up, the judge, Mr. Justice Gross, instructed the jury to put aside their emotions. The loss of these 5 young lives is clearly a tragedy. You're likely to have sympathy for the deceased and their families. Your sympathy must not sway you. You may view with some distaste the lifestyles of those involved. Whatever the drugs they took, whatever the work they did, no one is entitled to do these women any harm, let alone kill them. The trial lasted a month. It took the jury 8 hours to return unanimous verdicts on all 5 counts of murder. Guilty. On the 22nd of February 2008, Wright was sentenced to life imprisonment. Mr. Justice Gross recommended against parole because the murders involved a substantial degree of premeditation and planning. Some of the bereaved relatives called for the return of the death penalty. The Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, said the case was an example of the importance of a national DNA database, a project we covered in Psycho Killer's 3-part series about familial DNA.
In many ways, Wright's conviction posed as many questions as it answered. Firstly, experts have highlighted the improbability of any serial killer starting in later middle age. Wright was 48 in 2006. Serial killers almost always begin killing in their 30s. Psychologists told police it was highly likely Wright had killed prior to his spree of 2006. And a criminologist, David Wilson, who worked on the Ipswich case, stated afterwards that he felt the murders were far too practiced for someone murdering for the first time. At one point, Wright was a suspect in the Suzi-Lamplugh murder case. In fact, they'd worked together on the QE2 cruise ship during the early 80s. Suzi-Lamplugh was an estate agent who went missing in London in July 1986. She was legally declared dead in 1994, but her body was never found. However, the Metropolitan Police have all but eliminated Wright from the Lamplugh investigation. On the other hand, Cleveland police haven't ruled out a link between Wright and the murder of Vicky Glass, a heroin addict who vanished from Middlesbrough in September 2000. Her naked body was later found in a stream on the North Yorks moors. Shades of Gemma Adams and Tania Nicol? Well, you be the judge. In 2019, Wright was linked to the 1989 murder of Jeanette Kempton. She vanished from Brixton, South London, where Wright was running that pub. And her body was found in fields in Suffolk, Wright's other stamping ground. In 2021, Wright was arrested at HMP Long Lartin on suspicion of murdering Victoria Hall. The 17-year-old was murdered on her way home from a nightclub in Felixstowe, and her body was found in a ditch 5 days later. Suffolk police reopened their investigation in 2019 after receiving fresh witness information. They announced that Wright had been, quote, released under investigation, pending further enquiries, unquote. Only 2 months after this, police announced a re-investigation by a historical crimes unit into Vicky Glass's murder in order to pursue what they called new lines of enquiry. What do you think, Jack? Did one of Steve Wright's cellmates report something to the prison authorities, grass him up?
It's difficult to say. To be honest, I doubt it in these circumstances. Cell confessions are fraught with danger. You've got to consider the motives of the person claiming to have had the conversation. You've got to consider the motives of the person confessing to, because, prisons are full of odd people, aren't they, thrown into the mix. Any information, though, would always have to be considered, but I doubt it in this case.
Right, you are. Okay. Well, I suppose the nightmare scenario is that the murders for which Steve Wright was convicted are the tip of an iceberg. Since 2006, Wright's name has been mentioned in the context of more or less all the unsolved murders in the UK from 1990 onwards. I remember the talk in the BBC Television Centre bar used to be, if it wasn't Robert Black, then it must have been Steve Wright. You know what I mean? Fellow journalists, including Julian Sturdy at the University of East Anglia, who I was talking to recently, are looking at Wright's possible involvement in a cluster of unsolved murders in Norwich in the years before 2006. This was when Wright ran a pub, the Ferry-Boat, which was right in the middle of the city's red light district. Remember, Wright's Ipswich flat on London Road was also in the red light area. Some of those unsolved murders are Amanda Duncan at Ipswich in 1993, Kelly Pratt at Norwich in 2000, and Michelle Bettles again at Norwich in 2002. Michelle had been a regular at the Ferry-Boat. She'd told her parents about an unusual client, a man dressed in women's clothes, and Wright was known to cross-dress. Michelle was strangled and her body left next to a stream in woodland on the outskirts of Norwich. Correlation? Coincidence? Or, just my confirmation bias? What do you make of it, Jack?
Well, we've mentioned this before. We, and by we I mean society as a whole, we like to assume that killers, almost like shoplifters, never get caught the first time. We also know that killers occasionally do get away with it. What I'm reassured by is that Norfolk and Suffolk share a major crime team, and they will have reviewed the Michelle Bettles case and the others very thoroughly. Now, sex workers, by the nature of their work, are vulnerable to the mental state of their clients who operate in a clandestine environment and may have other sexual perversions.
Whether Wright did it, and if he did, whether he'll ever confess is anyone's guess. As far as we're aware at Psycho Killer, he's said nothing. I suppose he has no incentive. Life without parole, means exactly that. He's never coming out. But the shockwaves of the Ipswich murders rumble on. Over to you, Pip.
The murders refocused media attention on a number of controversial issues in the United Kingdom. Big issue number 1, prostitution. The murders exposed once again the vulnerability of sex workers and the lack of action taken by the government. A more punitive approach might reduce the number of prostitutes on the streets. Legalised brothels might be one way of improving the safety of women. Or what about reducing demand by prosecuting the punters instead? They do that in Sweden. And there was a vocal Shame the Johns campaign in British Columbia, in Canada, in the 1990s. The UK government had at one point considered allowing mini brothels, but abandoned this plan due to fears they'd attract pimps and drug dealers into residential areas or, dare I say it, nice neighbourhoods. So instead, anti-prostitution legislation got tougher. The Policing and Crime Act of 2009 made it illegal to pay for sex with a prostitute who has been subjected to force, and this is a strict liability offence. Clients can be prosecuted even if they did not know the prostitute was forced.
Jack, of course, you're familiar with this legislation in a professional capacity. Can you clarify what the law means by subjected to force? Does that mean coerced into selling sex by a pimp, for example?
Well, I think this legislation was introduced around concerns about people being trafficked for sex, more than the classic interpretation of a pimp living off immoral earnings. It seems to focus more on the exploitation or as you've just said, coercion. And I'd be interested to see the number of prosecutions that have taken place. They're more likely to be in brothels where someone has control over the women. Not so easy with street prostitution, where the women may appear to be operating under their own free will. Let's remember that sex workers, like their clients, are acting out these liaisons for their own needs. They're unlikely to discuss the finer details of why they're drawn to it.
Big issue number 2, drugs. Rather than pursuing a war on drugs, should cannabis, heroin and cocaine be legalised or decriminalised, provided on prescription to registered addicts, or penalised more harshly? High numbers, 95% according to the Home Office, of street prostitutes in the UK have a history of substance abuse. Selling sex is one way of funding addiction. Drugs were responsible for putting the Ipswich 5 on the street, and from there into Steve Wright's clutches. I can't imagine the government adopting such a radical approach, at least not in my lifetime. But desperate times call for desperate measures. What's the alternative? Just put up a memorial to all the murdered women and chisel on a new name every time another one dies needlessly? What do you think? Are legalised brothels the answer? Should society take a completely different approach to regulating drugs? What happens in your country? What do you do differently, and does it work? Can we in the UK learn lessons from where you live? Just reach out. On Twitter, we're at PsychoKillerPo, and our website is psycho-killer.co.
Grab your phone and join the debate. We'd like to feature your comments in a later edition of Psycho Killer.
There is a loose end we want to try to tie up. You'll remember that the day before Steve Wright was arrested, Monday the 18th of December, police took in a 37-year-old man for questioning about the Ipswich murders. This man, Tom Stevens, was subsequently released. Mr. Stevens wasn't charged with any offence in relation to the deaths of the 5 women, and he's always denied any involvement. But the question came up in court. Did Steve Wright act alone, or did he have an accomplice? Prosecutor Peter Wright QC suggested that in the cases of Anneli Alderton and Annette Nicholls, the evidence pointed to 2 possible criminals.
What exactly was the evidence that more than one assailant was involved? Peter Wright QC told Ipswich Crown Court the naked bodies of Anneli Alderton and Annette Nicholls were left in a dense thicket, but there were no drag marks or snag marks in keeping with them being hauled there by Steve Wright alone, dragged through the undergrowth. Therefore, Peter Wright QC said, the bodies must have been carried by more than one individual. Witnesses also reported a dark Ford Mondeo, like Steve Wright's, parked beside the road on the night of the 8th of December, right at the spot where Annette Nicholls' body was found. Next to it was a Renault Clio with its interior lights on. Did this car belong to an accomplice, or somebody who'd gone there for a casual sexual encounter, what some people call dogging? Or was it simply an ordinary motorist who'd stopped to eat a sandwich? Or back in 2006, read a map?
Right. More conjecture than hard evidence there, though. But if it was such a shot in the dark, why mention it in court and risk confusing the jury? We've mentioned before that the prosecutors hate to confuse the jury. They want to keep it simple. So why did they put it out there? Were they using the privilege of the courtroom, maybe to flush out this other individual by setting a few hairs running in the media? It wouldn't be for the first time, would it?
We like to think of serial killers as solitary individuals, but of course that's far from the truth. The hillside strangler who terrorised Los Angeles in the late 70s turned out to be 2 men, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono. The railway rapist John Duffy was jailed for life for a series of murders and rapes near railway stations around London. After a decade in prison, he told police about his accomplice, and in 1999, David Mulcahy was also given a life sentence. And let's not forget those most chilling of names, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, or Fred and Rose West.
Now, that's a tantalising hypothesis. If Steve Wright had an accomplice, could that accomplice have been a woman? But because nobody saw the crimes being committed, these questions are unanswered. The only person who knows for sure is Steve Wright himself. His last known whereabouts were Long Lartin Maximum Security in Worcestershire, and he is saying nothing.
What do you make of it? Did Steve Wright act alone, or did he have an accomplice? If so, did that accomplice have to be male? Let us know on Twitter at PsychoKillerPO, or through the website psycho-killer.co.
Thanks for listening. And now it's time for me and Pip and Jack to say goodbye until our next podcast. We'll see you again soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer, shocking true crime story.